My very first visit to Ottawa was part of a grade 8 school trip when I was 13 years old. And I was trying to remember anything about that trip. And the only thing that I can remember, and this is the sad part, is that we figured out how to make paper airplanes, set them on fire, and throw them out the windows of the Chateau Laurier. And because I was only 13, they couldn't throw me out. You see, I got in a lot of trouble, but I got to stay. So not a very auspicious beginning to my relationship with Ottawa. I've spent a fair amount of time here over the succeeding years. I never went back to the chateau. Funny that. And I've had a lot of fun, especially in some of the pubs on Elgin Street. When I was coming into the city, trying to get some kind of a sense of, so I stayed in Centertown because I wanted to get a sense of the downtown and what was going on. And so I got into a taxi and told the guy where I wanted to go from the airport, and he just said, "Oh." And I said, "What?" He said, "Oh, it's going to be tough to get there. There's a lot of traffic." And I said, "Okay." Got up this morning, was leaving the hotel. I told him where I was coming today, and I said, "How long do you think it'll take me to get here?" And they said, "Oh, it's a lot of traffic. It's going to be tough." So from that, and also my walking around in the downtown core and seeing, I think, more buses perhaps than I've ever seen in one place in my life, I got a sense that one of the issues for Ottawa may be transportation, as it is for any big and growing city, getting people to the places that they want to go. And so that sort of fits with some of the things that I want to talk about. I want to talk generally about mostly the pedestrian experience. And I want to talk about cities in a particular way that relates to my own training. I'm a psychologist. I'm a neuroscientist by training. And so I tend to think about people and what they are in ways that may not be the ways that you think about people much of the time. So I want to tell you, I want to go all the way back to the beginning of social organization and people. And I want to invite you to reflect on the illustration that you're seeing on the slide, which is obviously very diagrammatic. But what's being shown there is the organization of a Neolithic settlement. So tens of thousands of years ago, when people organized themselves into groups. The groups looked a little bit like this. They were typically about 100 to 150 people, and that turns out to be important. I'll return to that. And what is maybe not very clear from this diagram, but nevertheless is true, is that these people, these small groups of people, lived basically all of their lives outside and within sight of one another. So you can see some structures in the diagram, but those structures weren't actually dwellings. People didn't live inside dwellings. They stored some of their stuff, their kitchen tools and weapons and so forth, inside, but not themselves. So think about that. Think about people being outside, exposed to one another, within view of one another, knowing everyone else in the group all of the time. That's where we came from. That's, in many ways, the kinds of brains that we have. And I'll elaborate on that point. So clearly, a city like Ottawa, or any large city, even a modest-sized city, far outstrips those early Neolithic villages of 100 to 150 people. So one sort of obvious question, and I know this is something that everyone here probably thinks about some of the time, is, why do we do it? Why, given that we, as a species, were born into living in these small groups, why have we collected ourselves into larger and larger and larger groups? Well, there are some obvious answers that you can think of to that question, and they all sort of boil down to the same thing, and that is that the idea that there's strength in numbers, that together a large number of people can accomplish things that smaller groups of people simply can't. And this actually boils down to a nice set of mathematical relationships. You can show that there is a more than linear increase in all kinds of trends in human development with increasing population size. So we have higher income, we're more creative, we make more stuff, we're more productive, out of proportion to the increase in the size of our groups. So there are all kinds of reasons that you can identify why it's a good thing for us to live in larger groups. But as a psychologist, one of the things that I do, I think psychologists have a tendency to do this kind of thing. We always look for the dark side. So, and there is one. You know, these are the positives of living in cities, but what's bad about living, or at least challenging about city life? And so I'll give you one illustration of an experiment done by psychologists looking at the effects of urbanicity on the human brain. This is, you might have heard something about this study. It actually got a fair bit of media attention. It was a study that was done with German participants, but it was a Canada-German collaboration. And the idea was to compare the brains of people who had grown up or lived in different sizes of development. So a comparison of people who lived in very large cities, people who lived in small towns, and people who lived in rural settings. And the focus of the study was on a brain structure called the amygdala. So the amygdala is buried inside your temporal lobe. I'm sort of pointing to my own amygdala. I hope there's one in there. Pretty sure there is. And we know that it mediates a lot of our emotional reactions to events that take place in the world. And that's kind of a big oversimplification of the amygdala, but it'll do for this experiment. So what was done in this experiment was to take these different groups of people who had these different styles of life and different kinds of upbringings, and to put them in an MRI machine, a big magnet basically that could measure the activity of their amygdala, and then to challenge their amygdala in interesting ways. And psychologists are so great at thinking up the most nefarious things to do to people. We really are. So in this experiment, what was used was something called the Montreal stress test, Montreal stress imaging test. And the way that it works is that while you're in the MRI machine, and anybody here who's had their head in one of these tubes knows that it's all by itself not all that great an experience. You're lying on your back, your head's being measured, and you're being presented with mathematical questions, mental arithmetic questions. I think they were 2-digit multipliers. And so the questions are flashed on a screen. Your job is to answer the questions. While you're doing this, and this is the stress part, as if all of that wasn't enough, there's a social stress. And the social stress is that you can hear people in the room, the experimenters, and this is a setup, so you think that this is happening by accident, but what the people are saying is things like, oh my God, I can't believe he got that one wrong. Or, wow, she hasn't gotten a single question right yet. So you're getting this false feedback that you're completely bombing this test while everything else is going on. And the fascinating thing about the study was that it lit up a really strong group effect. So people who lived in big cities, their amygdala basically was going crazy under this kind of social stress. And people who lived in smaller settings or in the countryside didn't show those same kinds of effects. So here's a little bit of evidence, that one kind of evidence, that living in a city, living among large groups of strangers, which given our evolutionary lineage is something that's a really strange kind of way of living, actually changes the way that your brain works. So one of the things that, well, I'll come back to this. I'll carry on with the story a little bit. So again, thinking about this size of the Neolithic village, the 100 to 150 people in these ancient villages, and comparing that to how we live now. There is a primatologist whose name is Robin Dunbar, who did some really interesting comparisons among different species of monkeys. And what he looked at was the amount of time that monkeys spend getting to know one another. And the way that monkeys do that primarily is by grooming one another. You've probably seen this if you've watched nature documentaries or been to the zoo. Monkeys spend a lot of time picking crap out of each other's coats. And that's not just to keep each other clean. That's a way of getting to know one another, of understanding one another, of knowing where everyone sits in the pecking order. Although it's not pecking if it's a monkey, but anyway. And what Dunbar went on to look at, so he observed this, and then he went on to look at the relationship between the size of a group of monkeys and the size of their brains, especially the part of the brain called the neocortex. And what he discovered was that the larger the group size of monkeys, the more developed the brains of those monkeys were. And he argued that the reason for this had to do with that grooming and had to do with that laborious process of getting to know everyone in your troop. It's hard to keep track of who's done what to whom, as we all know from our own lives. It's hard. It's resource intensive. It takes brain power to keep track of all of that. The most fascinating thing that Dunbar did, I think, was to extrapolate from the numbers that he collected on the species of monkeys that he studied and said, okay, consider the human being as another primate in the monkey line. Given the size of our brain, what size of group should we have? And the number that he came up with was a number, I think the actual number is something like 118, but we say it's between 100 and 150. So, and that number has come to be called Dunbar's number, and Dunbar's argument is that human beings as a species are optimized for living in that size of group. Once we exceed that group size, then it essentially becomes impossible, given the power of our brains, to do all of the tracking that we need to do to keep track of who's doing what to whom. Obviously, we don't live this way. We live in much larger groups than 100 to 150. So one of the ways that I think about what a city is as a neuroscientist is that it's sort of you can think of it as a cognitive prosthesis. What good urban design should actually do is to find ways to help us to live under conditions that, evolutionarily speaking, are completely unnatural. We're not built to live in settings that include thousands and thousands, sometimes millions and millions of strangers. And so the best way to design a city is to find ways to help people to cope with the stresses and distresses that come along with that kind of living arrangement. So what I want to do for the rest of my talk is to give you three different examples of the ways that I think that good urban design can mitigate stress. And the first one has to do with nature, and I think that you basically have to have been living in a cave or under a rock or something to not have been exposed to the deluge of at least popular media accounts and certainly scientific evidence to suggest that there is something special about our connection with nature, that views of nature, immersion in nature, even as it turns out quite modest immersion in nature, can produce beneficial mental and physical effects. So there's all kinds of evidence for this. The very first study that was done was in the 1970s, and it was a really simple study looking at rates of recovery in surgical patients who had views of nature from their hospital rooms or not. And the finding, surprisingly enough, was that people who had such views recovered more quickly and required less pain relief than people who didn't have such views. And that was really kind of point alpha. And after that, there have just been, as I said, an avalanche of studies. One of the more interesting and recent ones was a study conducted by Mark Berman. Mark Berman is a psychologist at the University of Chicago, but this work was actually conducted in Toronto. And what you're looking at on this slide is a representation of the amount of tree cover that is available in different neighborhoods in the city of Toronto. And what Berman was able to show was that there's a really nice relationship between a wide range of health variables and the amount of tree cover in a neighborhood, right down to a city block level, to the extent the relationship was so predictive that it was possible for Berman to extrapolate from the data and say, plant 10 more trees on the boulevards in this city block, and you will increase the average lifespan of long-term residents on this block by 7 years. It was that precise a relationship. So in Berman's hands, in the hands of his team, very compelling evidence of something that I suspect I'm probably sort of bringing coals to Newcastle in saying this, but it's bringing very strong evidence that the presence of nature in cities is absolutely fundamental to, it's not just about an aesthetic, it's a fundamental feature of a city that both buffers us from some of the hard, stressful things about living in cities and also promotes good health. In our laboratory, we've been trying to figure out exactly why that is. You know, what is it about exposure to nature that produces those kinds of effects? And I don't have time to go into the full story of what we found out, but I'll give you a little bit of a taste by saying that we think that there's something special about the mathematics of images of nature. It's something called self-similarity. You probably at some point have heard of things called fractals. So the idea of a fractal is, in this case, something that has self-similarity to a number of scales. So the classic example of this is what you're looking at here, a fern frond. So if you look at the frond, you see the same shape in the large frond. You see that shape repeated at a smaller scale in the frondlets, and so on and so forth all down the line. It looks as though we have something in our brains, in a particular part of our brains, called this is a little bit fuzzy, but on the left you're looking at a bottom view of a human brain, and there's an area called the parahippocampal place area. And what we've discovered is that the parahippocampal place area actually has a strong preference for these kinds of scenes of nature, and it also has an abundance of a particular kind of receptor called opiate receptors. So think of opiate receptors, naturally occurring opiates, the runner's high, you've probably heard of. We have endogenous systems in our body that are designed to make us feel good. And there's accumulating evidence that there is just such a system in our brain that's specialized for making us feel good when we're presented with views of nature. So I think it's important for us to pursue questions about where these kinds of effects are coming from, how they're affecting our brains, because those of you who are involved in the work of building good cities would probably like to know the answers to questions like how much, how many, how often does somebody need to be to have a nature exposure to maintain good health? How many trees do you need on your boulevard? Does it make a difference? And it turns out that it does, whether those trees are in public space or in private space. Those are the kinds of questions that we can begin to answer with the kind of research that we're doing. So this is a somewhat local view of nature. These areas in cities are terribly important to maintain and to preserve. And again, they're one of the things that buffer us from the trauma, in a way, of living among large groups of strangers. So here, the second example has to do with the design of building facades. And here's an interesting building facade in Ottawa. We began to study this a number of years ago through an opportunity that came to my lab to work with an organization called the BMW Guggenheim Laboratory. And the way that this sort of came about was that the BMW Guggenheim Laboratory was set up as kind of a magnet for people to come and talk about, hear about, think about urban issues. And at some point early on in the planning of this laboratory, somebody said, you know, we're calling this a laboratory. We really should have an experiment. And somebody who was in the organizing committee for that laboratory, and it turns out to have been Charles Montgomery, whom I heard that came to speak to you a couple of years ago, said, I know a guy who does experiments like this. And I got the call and designed a walking experiment. And in this experiment, people were led from place to place, and they were shown views of different kinds of streetscapes, and they were asked questions about what they saw. What you're seeing here is a map of one of the walks. This is actually the first set of walks that we did in New York City. We also ran walks in Berlin and in Mumbai. Here is an example of what an experiment might have looked like. So a group of people carrying smartphones. The smartphones are programmed to ask them questions. And they're also wearing these devices on their wrists. And these devices are actually able to measure an aspect of the physiology of the people who are taking the walk. The measure is something called skin conductance. It's basically a measurement of, in a way, your sweat glands. And the reason that we're interested in sweat is because it gives us a little window into things like stress. Where does urban stress come from? So what we're able to do with this measure is basically to devise things that look like this. This is a stress map of the walk in New York City. So what you see here is just a Google Earth map of New York City. You can see these blue contours, and the height of the contour basically represents the averaged arousal value of a group of walkers in this experiment. And you can see some interesting things. For example, you can see places like here, for example, where that arousal value goes really high. And what was happening here is that people were walking up a quiet street to a very, very busy intersection. And you can see here we had people in a nice community garden in Manhattan, and you could see those arousal levels go nice and low. So it gives us a way of measuring people's arousal as they move through a city. You can use it in a number of different ways. We've used it to measure pedestrian stress. And the most dramatic example of this was an experiment that we did in Mumbai, which if you've been to Mumbai, you know that for a pedestrian, life is not easy there. That crossing a street involves, I've always thought, some sort of combination of ballet and parkour to get from one side of a street safely to another in a city where the cars basically never stop. And so when I got there, traumatized and culture shocked as I was, spending hours trying to walk really short distances, I asked lots of local people, you know, what's it like to live in a city where it's so hard just to walk from one place to another? And they said, oh, it's no big deal, you just get used to it. And so I nodded and said, okay, well, let's put that to the test. So we did some experimentation where we did what you're seeing in this photograph, which looks sort of innocuous, but what's going on here is that we were leading groups of local Mumbaikers to busy traffic circles and standing them in, not in the center of the traffic circle, because that's sort of, well, unethical, to say the least, but in them, and asking them to assess for themselves how stressed they felt, and also using our bracelets to measure their levels of stressful arousal. And what we found there, I think, is one of the most interesting findings in these experiments, and that was that, and I think this is important, and this is maybe important for a planner to know as well, that there is a big disconnect between how stressed we might feel, how stressed we might think we are, and what's actually going on in our bodies. So when I say I've gotten used to something, that doesn't necessarily mean that's a good thing. That doesn't mean that all of the negative health consequences of the stress exposure have gone away. It just means, really, that I know what it feels like, and it feels the same crappy way that it felt last time I had to do something like this. But in terms of the chronic health effects of those stress exposures, they're still going on, even if you're shrugging your shoulders and saying that it's not a big deal. So we did some other experiments with pedestrian stress. This is just from one participant walking in one of the busiest traffic areas of Mumbai, a notorious junction called the Kalinagar junction. And what you're seeing there, the contours mean the same thing. The height of the contour is the level of stressful arousal. And you can see, for example, that it rises to a gigantic peak right here. Hopefully you can make that out. And what that's telling us is that in this particular case, before someone arrives at a crossing where they know they have to get across the street, their arousal levels are just off the charts in preparation for this crossing. Once things are underway and they've mapped a strategy which is going to be running between moving cars, the arousal levels actually go down a little bit. But in preparation, getting ready for that, arousal levels are getting really high. So you can think about that in a bunch of different ways. You can think, on the one hand, well, in a way that's a good thing, because you don't want somebody sleepwalking across a busy intersection. You want them to be aroused and alert and aware. But on the other hand, if they have to do that too much of the time as they're walking through a city, then over the course of time, that's going to exact a toll on their bodies and their minds, and it's going to lead to chronic disease, metabolic disease, cardiac disease, a range of probably even psychiatric disorders. Depression can be triggered by chronic exposure to stressors. So even though Ottawa is not Mumbai, and happily from the standpoint of the pedestrian experience, few cities are, those kinds of stresses still exist, and they still come into play for pedestrians trying to navigate city streets. But that's not really even the reason in this first instance why we were measuring people's arousal levels on streets. It had more to do with their responses to urban facades, the skins of buildings, the organization of the streetscape. And one of the things that we did was to compare what people call a number of different things, open versus closed facades, for example, permeable versus impermeable facades. The idea basically is a comparison of a facade that has lots of openings, lots of things to see, lots of doorways, windows, activity, with facades that don't. And what you're seeing here is a couple of examples of nice open permeable facades. The one on the left in New York, the one on the right in Berlin. And you can find lots of lovely facades like that as well here in Ottawa. And here the comparison was with closed facades. Again, it's New York on the left, Berlin on the right. That's a controversial Whole Foods store. That poor Whole Foods store has had a lot of negative press coverage, sadly, because of its closed facade. It's a block-long facade with frosted windows. There's nothing to see, nothing to do, nothing to look at. And the facade on the right in Berlin, believe it or not, is the facade of a restaurant. I stopped a lot of people asking them what this building was, and interestingly, nobody knew. Nobody had been in there. But as you can see, it's very much obviously closed and impermeable. What we did in our experiment was to compare people's responses to those open and closed or permeable and impermeable facades, both again by asking them questions about their feelings. So here, this slide is labeled self-assessed affect. That's the vertical axis. And what it's showing is that there is a tendency for people to like high complexity facades more than low complexity facades. It's a small difference, but it's measurable and it's statistically significant for whatever that's worth. The more impressive difference came from measurements from the bracelets. People's levels of physiological arousal went actually lower than baseline during exposure to these low complexity closed facades, and went higher than baseline when exposed to these more complex facades. So higher, but not brutally high as in the case of crossing a street in the Kalanagar Junction or anything like that. So there's, what does this show? It shows that our minds and our bodies are being affected by the streetscapes that we walk through in all kinds of interesting ways. And these ways, to some extent, line up with our own assessments of how much we like or don't like particular streetscapes. Streetscapes that are low in complexity, repetitive. In our experiments, we sometimes call them low in entropy, which means basically the same thing. They drop our level of physiological arousal below baseline. And this might sound like a bit of a contradiction with respect to what I've just said, but what we know is that it's healthy for us to have some kind of middle level. We don't want our nervous system to be sent off to sleep. We don't want to be bored. Boredom, it turns out, can actually also have deleterious health effects. Boredom can be stressful by itself. It can shorten lifespans. Boredom actually, over the long term, and enough of it will kill us. So we want to hit the kind of middle ground. And that's very much in line with traditional thinking in experimental psychology. There was a psychologist named Daniel Berline, spent his career at the University of Toronto studying responses to complexity in a wide range of different animals, everything from cockroaches and rats and mice to human beings. And what Berline said was basically the kind of thing that I'm showing in urban streetscapes, and that is that there's kind of a sweet spot for complexity, that in the mid-range of complexity, we really, this slide is actually labeled aesthetic judgment. So we really like the mid-level values. The mid-level values produce healthy levels of nervous system stimulation, but not an overabundance of that kind of stimulation. And it seems to be the case that the same kinds of principles hold for urban streetscapes as well. So, and there are all kinds of great examples of, for example, reorganization of streetscapes to increase their level of complexity towards healthy levels, as shown here in the bottom part of this slide. these two. This is a street corner in Melbourne, before and after a modification that changed its complexity and changed its attraction to urban streetgoers. Here's a slide to point out that it's not necessarily just the case that the downtown big, boring, monolithic bank buildings, for example, or office buildings are the ones that are guilty of producing boring, sterile streetscapes. The same kind of thing can happen in other parts of a city. So here's a suburban streetscape. This is not Ottawa. This is a suburban streetscape in Guelph. But you can find stuff like this in most major cities. And although in one sense you might say, well, it's open because it has every house has a door and every house has windows, you have the same kind of repeating element over and over and over again as you walk down a street. So in terms of nervous system activity, that's going to push things towards the low side. It's going to produce boredom, and that's not very good. I'm going to skip over this just because I see that I've got about 10 minutes left. I want to make sure I have time to say everything. So I'll just I won't tell you anything. I'll just skip over it to this. This is the last thing that I want to talk about. I want to talk about the experience of awe, not in the totally awesome, banal sense of that word. I want to talk about the experience of awe, as everyone here has had at some point in your lives. So, for example, the first time that this image was sent around the world in 1968, it produced an effect so profound in people that we've given it a name called the overview effect. It was felt, of course, most profoundly by the astronauts who actually saw this Earthrise, but it was felt by everybody who saw the image so far as we know. And it was a variety of the feeling of awe, the same kind of feeling of awe that you might get from watching a violent thunderstorm, from peering over the edge of the Grand Canyon, to looking at Niagara Falls, looking at a beautiful inky starlit night, admiring the accomplishments of somebody like a Stephen Hawking. All of those things can produce a feeling of awe. And we define awe, psychologists define awe as a state in which we are made aware of the relative enormity of something. So we're made aware, in contrast, of our own smallness and, in a way, our insignificance. And then the other ingredient of awe is that it can be life-changing, that it produces epiphany. It's, of course, no accident that many of the best examples of awe-inspiring architecture are religious architecture, and that's quite deliberate. The intention is to produce this kind of feeling of awe. Psychologists have become really interested in awe, including us. And one of the things that we've been doing, so here's an awe-inspiring vista, which is from the city of Ottawa. We've been doing some experiments at this point so far only with photographs of architectural and only interiors so far. But what we've been trying to do is to figure out what kinds of ingredients, what constitutes for the built setting, what are the likely ingredients to produce the sensation of psychological awe. And so with the help of a grad student of mine, Hannah Nagami, we've been looking at we've been doing experiments where we've been showing people a large number of images of architectural interiors. We've been asking them to in some cases, participants are classifying the buildings, they're describing the size of the space, they're describing its ornamentation, a large number of different kinds of features. And then in other experiments, we're asking people to rate the emotions that are elicited by exposure to the photographs. And so what we're trying to do with all of this is to try to figure out whether we can boil down to a relatively small number of things what kinds of ingredients in the built setting are more likely to produce a feeling of awe. So, and here's a couple of images just to give you the sense from our experiments. This image, it's of a swimming pool in the Hearst Castle in California. This, of all of our images, was the one that produced the highest ratings of awe in all of our participants. And the next image is the one that produced the lowest ratings of awe. And everybody always laughs at this picture, so we should probably study humor as well. Irony or something. So what we've studied so far is architectural interiors. I have no reason to doubt whatsoever that the same kinds of principles will apply to architectural exteriors, the skins, the surfaces, the designs of buildings. The things that we've learned so far are that the immensity of a structure is an important ingredient to producing awe. But other things are important as well, things like the amount of ornamentation, things like evidence that there's a lot of care taken in building the structure. Things like, interesting things like lighting effects and that we haven't really gotten to the bottom of yet, symmetry. All of those kinds of ingredients we've discovered are more likely to produce an awe-inspiring vista. So far in our hands only interiors, but again, I suspect that this will apply to exteriors as well. And so, why would we care? Why would we care about whether or not an urban citizen experiences awe on a regular basis? Well, it turns out, and in a way, it's a little bit like the nature story. It's more than aesthetic. It's more than just a cool thing that makes us feel good or makes us identify with or attach to our cities, although it can do all of those things. But it changes other things about us as well that are more fundamental. Psychological experiments with awe experiences have shown that when we have recently had an awe experience, we change the way that we treat one another. We become more patient. We become kinder. We're more likely to behave philanthropically by giving money to a charity, for example. We're more likely to, if we spot someone who needs some help, we're more likely to stop and to help them. So having those awe experiences will change the way that we treat one another, which again, if you think back to the idea of a city as a prosthetic device, is something that's important. Not only that, the experience of awe, as it turns out, and this is one of those things that I think is almost too cool to be true, but it is. Experiencing awe, like many of the other things that I've talked about so far, will actually change your physiology. So we have these things in our bodies called cytokines, and here's an illustration of what cytokines look like. They are elements in our body. They're quite important. They're involved in mounting inflammatory responses. So inflammatory responses can actually be good things. We want our bodies to respond to injuries by becoming inflamed. But there's such a thing as chronic inflammation, and probably everybody in this room, unless you live a very clean, healthy lifestyle, has some chronic inflammation. And that chronic inflammation is produced by some of these same kinds of cytokines as well, interleukins, for example. And so the really interesting finding here is that if you experience awe, the levels of these damage-inducing cytokines actually decreases in your bloodstream. So experiencing awe is actually good for you in a different way to the experience of nature, but no less a fundamental constraint, or should be a fundamental constraint, on how cities are built. So when you think about, I heard this morning about things like protected view sheds in Ottawa, for example, and of course Ottawa is not the only city that invokes rules about what kinds of things can be done to block the really nice views of parts of a city. And again, that's not, as it turns out, just an aesthetic. That's not just to make a city look nice. It's not just about pleasantness. It's about affecting the way that people treat one another. It's about helping us to, again, come to terms with what we have built for ourselves to live in that contrasts with what our brains have actually evolved to cope with. And it's fundamentally, just as with nature, a matter, and with facade design for that matter, a matter of public health.